on today's StoryBeat.
I was asked by several actors this question is, what's my character's motivation? And it occurred to me that all characters in every play, in every movie, in every novel ever written, made, or whatever have the same motivation, which is to get the hell out of the story. They do not want to be in the story. Romeo and Juliet want to get out on page 2. Gregory Peck wants to destroy the guns of Navarone on page 6. Baby Driver wants to get the girl and rob the bank on page 2, but you don't let them.
This is StoryBeat with Steve Cuden, a podcast for the creative mind. StoryBeat explores how masters of creativity develop and produce brilliant works that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Steel City, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My guest today, writer-director Charlie Peters, was raised in New York City before spending his high school years at Stonyhurst College in Lancashire, England, where he was classmates with the director Charles Sturridge and actor Edward Duke. Charlie then studied theater at the University of Connecticut and subsequently received a Schubert Fellowship to do graduate work in playwriting at Carnegie Mellon University right here in Pittsburgh. While at CMU, his plays were acted by fellow students, including Holly Hunter and Cherry Jones. After graduating, he returned to New York to work as a playwright. His plays have been produced at La Mama Experimental Theater Club, Primary Stages, Playwrights Horizons, the Actors Theater of Louisville, and the Edinburgh Festival. In 1978, Charlie was brought to Los Angeles by Columbia Pictures as part of a program looking for new writers, a program that turned out to be little more than a publicity stunt to distract from the bad PR Columbia had received as a result of its head, David Begelman, embezzling money from various actors. Charlie's first produced movie, Paternity, is based on a play he'd written while at CMU. It starred Burt Reynolds and was directed by David Steinberg. He's had a dozen other movies produced, including Blame It on Rio, directed by Stanley Donen, Kiss Me Goodbye, directed by Robert Mulligan, and Her Alibi, directed by Bruce Beresford. He's also directed two of his own, Passed Away with Bob Hoskins, Maureen Stapleman, and Frances McDormand, and Music from Another Room with Jude Law and Brenda Blethyn. Charlie has doctored over 40 other produced movies and many more unproduced ones. Renee Zellweger won the Golden Bear Award at the Berlin Film Festival for the 2010 movie My One and Only that Charlie wrote. His most recent film was 5 Flights Up, based on the novel by Jill Cement, which starred no less than Morgan Freeman and Diane Keaton. So for all those reasons and many more, it's a great honor and privilege for me to be joined on StoryBeat today by the multi-talented Charlie Peters. Charlie, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for having me. It's sort of fun to be back in Pittsburgh almost.
Almost. So let's go back in time a little bit. You've been a writer most of your life, basically. And so when did that begin for you? When did you first get the bug that you wanted to be a playwright and be in the theater or movies, whatever? When did it start?
Well, it started pretty early. I was living in New York City as a young boy with a single mother, who among many of her jobs was a stringer for a newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
And she was paid 3 cents a word and occasionally 5 cents a word. And in those days, the stories would come back to us through a messenger. And my job was to read those stories and see which words were red penciled and to count them and to make sure that she was paid the right amount of money. So I got into writing backwards. Most people get in as a sort of adolescent romantic urge to tell their life story. To me, it was 3 cents a word. I read a lot, so I wasn't illiterate, but it taught me how it is, in fact, can be a business. And kind of, one of the things I've heard since is what one of the great English writers says, Samuel Johnson, anyone who writes for any reason other than money is a blockhead. I don't believe in that, but it was a job. But I did go to a lot of theater in New York City. My mother, loved to go and take me. So I saw a lot of Broadway, and I went on my own. I even as a kid, when I was like even 14 or 13, I would sometimes do what they call second act it, which
Yes.
is to go into the second act of a play, which I couldn't afford to go into the I mean, I wasn't poor, but I didn't have that kind of money.
Right.
And I would second act it. And I think I second acted Peter Brook's Midsummer Night's Dream maybe 36 times. And eventually the ticket takers, who were at that point to me old ladies, they're like half my age now, they kind of knew who I was. And one would just look at me without saying anything and then just like nod to an empty seat. In other words, you can take that one because that was empty in the first act.
I've always thought it'd be better when you're in the theater if the seats were full, whether they were paid for or not.
Well, that's true, but I mean, I was nervous about being caught and thrown out, which never happened. But I was lucky to see a lot of shows. I actually saw the first production of Man of La Mancha off Broadway.
Oh wow!
In the amphitheater when it was 99 seats. So I mean, it was exciting, and that was the bug that got me into it.
Can you think of one particular thing that you went, wow, I've got to do this, or was it just the whole mass of it?
I think it was that production of Man of La Mancha. It was very dramatic and melodramatic, and and then as you pointed out, I went to spent my high school years in England, and in England, theater is not just like an extra; it's kind of part of your education.
Mm-hmm.
It's not being pretentious, but they take it more a part of their culture than we do here. So I was in a lot of plays, and I studied a lot. I wrote some, I acted in them, and it just got me so that I came back to the U.S. when I got drafted. Luckily, I failed my physical, but and ended up at UConn, and then, as you pointed out before, I got a Schubert Fellowship to do grad work in CMU. Were
you watching movies at the same time? Were movies a thing?
I was not a moviegoer. No, I occasionally would walk to the west side of the Thalia and see some foreign movie. There was usually the same 10 foreign movies all year long. But I saw the big ones. I saw The Graduate, which I loved, and and The Exorcist and stuff like that.
Sure.
But no, I was not a movie person, and that's sort of an irony.
You'd been writing plays for a while before you went to Los Angeles. When did you start to write screenplays? How did you learn how to write the form called a screenplay?
It was that program that you mentioned in your opening, David Begelman, who was convicted of fraud, or whatever the technical word is for. He was, if an actor, say, was given $100,000 to be in a movie, he would take 10,000 out of it without telling them. And I suspect because most actors were happy to be working, they kind of didn't say anything.
Mm-hmm.
And then he made the mistake of taking a lot of money out of the check of Cliff Robertson.
Yes.
For the movie he did called Charlie.
Yes.
Now, it just so happened that Cliff Robertson was married to maybe the wealthiest woman in America, who was Dina Merrill, who was the heiress of the Post Toasties. Her mother was the Post cereal money, and her father founded E.F. Hutton.
Yes.
So there was no problem if they wanted to say, you took my money. And when that became public, that became a scandal out here. And as a result, as you rightly pointed out, Columbia did this thing where they took 10 playwrights and 10 actors from around the country. They went to universities, one being CMU, and said, please suggest a writer, and we will pick 10 of them. And I was walking down the street doing a play at the City Theater, and I bumped into Leon Katz, my playwriting teacher, and he said, I got this thing from Columbia. I think you'd be good. I'm going to put your name in. I said, well, why not? What the hell, And 6 months later, I was in, I was accepted, and I thought, they paid my airfare, the hotel, apartment rather. They rented me a car. I mean, they did everything right because they were, Columbia Pictures, and we were all struggling writers. So anything would have been big money to us.
So was there someone there that was training you on this very unique form called screenplay?
Yes. There was a writer called David Zelig Goodman, who had done a number of movies, and he was chosen as to speak to us about it. Although it really wasn't a class like you do now, and I've since taught classes at USC and other places where you have the sort of the classic 3-act structure, the Robert McKee, the Save the Cat and all that. I had no idea. I really didn't. I just wrote a story. If it worked, it worked, and all I had to do was write one screenplay for him, and I did. And the studio had to buy them because that was considered speculative writing by the Writers Guild. So they paid us, I think, $10,000 for each of our screenplays because that was the minimum. And a couple of agents sort of circled around us thinking, maybe there's somebody there with some talent. And I met a fellow from William Morris, and he said, do you have any other screenplays? I said, yeah, I'm working on one. And I gave it to him. And within like 2 weeks, Burt Reynolds had signed on, and I don't talk about money, but I had sold it for more money than anyone had ever sold their first spec screenplay for.
Well, that better than anybody. That's highly unusual. Oh
yeah, no, it really was. I mean, Burt had movies all lined up, but one of them fell out, and he had a few months free, and he liked this. The movie, I'm sure no one's seen it, but the odd thing about it is that it was a radical plot. It was a story about a man who wanted to have a child but didn't want a wife. So in a sense, it was about surrogate parenthood before that phrase was even coined.
Right.
And it was such a ridiculous idea, that it just like, wow, that's really that could be really funny. Well, unfortunately, while we were making the movie, it was slowed because there was a long actor strike in the middle of it. So it took almost 7 months to make the movie. A famous case happened in New Jersey, the first case of a lawsuit dealing with child surrogacy, parent surrogacy, called the Baby M case.
Yes, so, sure.
By the time our movie came out, we were vilified, I was, for making fun of this serious subject that I just sort of thought, I just made up. So it got a lot of attention. It wasn't a particularly great movie, but, it put me on the map, and suddenly I was the hot screenwriter for a number of years.
And about what age were you at this point?
I was 28.
28. So you'd been around the writing world for a little while, not in Hollywood per se, but in playwriting and so on, New York and so on. The question that I have, was there a point from your early days of trying to write plays, eventually writing screenplays, was there a point where you said to yourself, you know what, I am pretty good at this. This is something I should pursue as a life's work. Was there some kind of an epiphany like that for you?
Well, I mean, I think there was as a playwright. I mean, I wanted to do that. I wanted to pursue it. That's why I went to CMU to get a master's degree in it. I mean, it really helped me because when I was at CMU, I did a lot of plays there. I mean, my classmates put them on as productions, and one of them actually got, as you mentioned, got moved by CMU to La Mama Theater. The director there, David McKenna, and I took our version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde to La Mama. So I thought, okay, I could maybe make a living, but I didn't expect it. It wasn't for money. Hollywood money was just a different thing. And suddenly when I was 29, I get a check for arguably more money than everyone in my family and throughout history put together have ever made.
Well, as they say in the theater, you can't make a living, but you can make a killing.
Yeah, no, that's true. So, but it was good. I mean, I was able to take care of, my mother who had sacrificed a lot of her life for me. So it was just.
How interesting that you took Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde to New York. And of course, I'm very well affiliated with that particular story, considering I created the musical of it.
Yeah, so, no, that's when I read that, it's interesting. Well, our take on it was it's the story is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, not Dr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde.
Right.
So in our play, they were together.
I see.
because that to me is it points out the psychoses of schizophrenia, or whatever you want to call it, of how you deal with the other side of you at the same time. It was fun.
I asked this question of a lot of creative people, and especially writers. I'm always fascinated by the answers I get. What for you makes a good story good? Why does it work? Why is it good? Do you have some idea in your head as to what makes it work?
Well, I've often been asked, plays and things like that. Some people call it a trick question or device. Although it reminds me briefly, when I was a kid in England, I worked with Connor Cruz O'Brien, a writer, and he was talking about a play of his in which he talked about a device or a trick. And I asked him, I said, well, what's the difference between a device or a trick? He said, a device is a trick that works. So I was asked by several actors this question is, what's my character's motivation?
Mm-hmm.
And it occurred to me that all characters in every play, in every movie, in every novel ever written, made, or whatever have the same motivation, which is to get the hell out of the story. They do not want to be in the story. Romeo and Juliet want to get out on page 2. Gregory Peck wants to destroy the guns of Navarone on page 6. Baby Driver wants to get the girl and rob the bank on page 2, but you don't let them. They've got 150, or if it's a long movie, 250 pages left. So that to me then became the sort of the idea, and the danger point was that when you start to enjoy, not that you can't enjoy writing the movie, but make sure that your characters don't enjoy being in the movie. Because once they do, it's over. Now, there's a device you could say like, well, they're happy, but if they're happy, there has to be a bomb under the table that the audience sees, but they don't. And eventually it's got to go off, or they've got to see the bomb.
You're the first person I've ever heard articulate it this way, which is why I find it fascinating. You're saying that every character of any value or worth in successful, memorable, popular movies simply wants to get out of the story.
Yeah, I mean, they want to stop it. They would prefer to be in the audience looking at it, not being in it. I mean, there's a great irony in that, having been to countless acting classes, is that the actors in the world are all desperate, and rightly so, to get on stage to play characters that are desperate to get off stage.
Interesting. That is very interesting. Well, the way that I've taught it forever is that it's a character in search of a goal with endless obstacles in their way, which is sort of a similar way of saying it. I like your way much better. I think.
Well, obstacles and conflict are the two. If you don't have that in virtually every scene, then the scene is cuttable. The great French farceur, Georges Feydeau said, they asked him, how he writes a play. And he said, well, first I create two characters who must never meet, and then I have them meet as soon as possible. So it just sounds a little bit like my dating history, but still, we get the idea.
So do you write every day?
No, I not right now. I used to write every day because I was hired to write every day.
Right.
Yeah, I guess I do. I mean, but it's not always just a play or a movie that I'm trying. I'll just scribble ideas and things.
Do you have anything special that you do to stimulate or trigger story ideas? Is there anything do you go on walks? Do you go to museums? Do you watch movies? Is there something that you do, or you just let life roll by you?
No, it's just my head is full of voices and full of stories. I mean, I see them, and I hike a lot out here in Santa Monica, and I'd probably do that if I wasn't writing. So I have no problem with stories. I have too many stories.
Well, that's a real good problem to have.
Well, I guess especially if you're being paid to write them, like I was in the old days.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, now it's different. I have learned that it's, as I've gotten older, there are certain personal stories that I wish to write. And I've learned by doing it and by writing them. Personal stories are a big danger to writers, because what you do is you confuse the event and the emotion. If X happened to you as a child, you know X, you know the event. You're not really interested. You're interested in telling the audience the emotion you're feeling.
Right.
Here's the truth. The audience doesn't give a damn about your emotion. They want to see the event so that they can have the emotion. And that's a technique that you learn in acting class. It's the old adage, don't cry on stage, try not to cry so that the audience cries. As I'm getting older and I'm writing a couple of things that are very personal to me, I'm aware of that problem. I did write a movie, the one Renee Zellweger did, which I put in a plug for her. She is the nicest person I've ever worked with. It was about somebody who went through something similar to mine as a child in his childhood. Not at all, exactly like it, but close enough that I was locked into the events of his life, but I was able to adjust them a little and use my emotion. And that's why I think that movie worked. Mm-hmm. It didn't get released in the United States, but still it worked.
Where do you typically begin when you're working on a story? Do you start with character or plot, or how does it work for you to plot?
Plot, yeah. It's an old, sort of tired adage, plot makes the character. Fair enough. I guess, to be honest, you could say I'm the character in every plot. I'm egotistical enough to, that it takes a lot of work to go somewhere else. But it's fun to do that. Once you get the plot done.
And do you find that developing the plot is a very difficult thing to do, or sometimes they just come flowing out of you?
Sometimes it's difficult. Sometimes it's easier. I've done it for a long time, so it's probably a bit easier. But maybe that's a bad thing. Maybe it should be harder for me.
Well, you've already somewhere in your career, you've already eliminated a lot of things that don't work. So you're heading toward those things that do.
I'd like to write that down. That makes me feel good. Maybe, but I really, in the beginning, when I, after I got into writing for a film, I still had no idea really about how to write a film until much later. I just made a lot of mistakes. I was very lucky to get these movies made, and and worked with some, a couple of the directors you mentioned. They liked working with me, and I figured, well, they know about making films. Stanley Donen did, some of the greatest American movies. Singing in the Rain, and Robert Mulligan did probably my favorite movie of all time, which is To Kill a Mockingbird. So, I was under their tutelage, but
yeah, not bad storytellers.
Yeah. But I think the thing is that why I kept working was from my theater, was that I wrote for actors. Actors wanted to do my stuff. And today, when your script goes into a producer and it gets probably read by an 11-year-old graduate of film school who can tell you Robert McKee beginning and forward, but they know nothing about acting. Not nothing. I don't mean to sound really pompous about that, but most of them don't. And actors said they wanted to do it. That's why Burt wanted to do my movie, Sally Field, James Caan.
So what is it then? Is it your dialogue? Is it strictly your dialogue? Or is it that you understand how to develop a character in a way that also appeals to them?
I think it's probably a bunch of things. I think my dialogue was influenced a lot by my years in England. There's sort of like an ease and a sort of a musicality to dialogue in Britain, mm-hmm. especially when you're doing comedy. That used to be in older American movies, but is not so much in current American movies. It is a lot.
Well, there's a rhythm to the old style, or to plays that are good. There's a rhythm that you don't see anymore in movies, or rarely.
Well, yeah. I was writing something recently, and as a result, or as a lesson, I recorded His Girl Friday and would watch that a couple of times a week before I got into this play I was writing.
Well, that's snappy. That's snappy dialogue. That's real fast.
Yeah, that's like, but when you work for a studio like Disney, it's master 2-shot close-up bang. And that's not how my stuff works best.
So His Girl Friday, was that Hector MacArthur? Who wrote that?
Yeah, that originally it was. There were several versions. But the one I looked at is, Cary Grant and Rosalind Russell.
Right, sure. Do you think about the audience as you're writing? Are you concerned about who you're writing for to ultimately consume it, or is that not part of your thought process?
No, I think about the audience in terms of I want them to to be into it, and it's human. It's a human story. I guess the difference when you write now for a film is, at least for a while back, was, are you writing a studio movie or an independent? Mm-hmm. That's and The trick I learned for that was choose which one. Don't try to do both, because if you write for an indie, it might be good and you'll get an independent audience and they'll like it and they'll go. And if it's really good, it will make the transition to a studio movie. In other words, it'll make the transition to a much broader audience. But
can you define what those two things are for the listeners, what the difference is between an indie and a studio in terms of the artistic part of it, the creative part of it?
Well, I mean, it's just a different subject matter. It's depends upon the relationships more. It's not as I mean, one of the a studio movie I did, like Three Men and a Little Lady. I mean, that's part of that. That's a certain kind of movie. And then, when I did Five Flights Up, it was just a different dynamic and a much smaller audience, much to the annoyance of the producers of Five Flights Up. But that's it. But sometimes they cross over.
Would you say, and I hate to use these cliches, but is one more for an art house audience and one is more for
I guess
a widespread audience?
Basically what I'm saying, the art house audience. I mean, that always sounds a little, I understand why you said it's always a little pretentious because you're thinking,
yes.
Art is, but what the hell? The studios do make movies for a broader audience, and the independents are for a more specific audience.
Right. So now you've got a story, you've got a plot in your head. How do you figure out who the characters are? What do you do to develop characters?
Well, I guess I do think of the characters while I'm coming up with the plot. It's really kind of, you are what you do. It's what are the characters forced to do given this situation that determines who they are. That's who we are as people, how we react to a situation.
So you're developing that as you're working on plot, because you essentially need to know who's in the story, I assume, whether it's a male or female, whether they're smart or not very, or who they are. You need to kind of know who those people are, I assume, as you're going along.
I have a character that I think it's, and again, it's generally of a certain type. I don't want to write down to people or, write about things I don't know about. It's of a certain, it's a person in a certain type of world. I mean, there are certain directors who have that. I mean, Woody Allen has, pretty much for the most part. I mean, people say his movies took place between 25 square blocks in Manhattan. But some of them are the best movies of our time. So it didn't limit him that way.
Mm-hmm. Well, for sure. I mean, sometimes my personal opinion is sometimes limiting yourself is actually better. It's more creative. It gives
absolutely.
Gives you certain freedoms that too much gives you not enough. I mean, it's constricting by going too wide.
You're right about that. Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I was talking to someone yesterday about how when I worked with Robert Mulligan on our movie, it was an okay movie, but the joy I really got out of it was talking a lot to him.
Mm-hmm.
And he did a lot of live theater, live theater on television in the 1950s.
Right.
So he did plays that were then shown on TV, like Sidney Lumet started that way, Sidney Pollack started that way, and Robert Mulligan. But he said something interesting. They used to have to do television takes, which were, if in the movie which they were showing, they would say, "Oh, get this goddamn chair out of the way." They would have to shoot a take that said, "Get this gosh darn chair out of the way." Right. And then they would cut it into the movie, which would then be shown on television. And he said to me, something happened. He said, the actors were always better in the television takes.
Why is that?
Because they were constricted.
They were constricted. So they put more meaning into that line where they didn't need to use the language that was somehow attenuated.
And the language that they were used to in the play, because they rehearsed it or the movie, but they had to think about it. And it really changed my whole idea about acting and language in movies. Sometimes I listen to modern movies. It's just the dialogue is, the actors and directors and writers like to think it's real, but there's no dialogue that's real. There's
no. My early training taught me that once you start to write a script or once you start to stage a play or a movie or whatever, you're automatically into the world of artifice. You're already one step removed from reality.
Yeah, because one thing is people are actually listening to each other. Nobody listens to anyone else. They die. I went to a speech for the guy who taught Obama how to speak before he ran for senator and eventually president. And he said that only 7% of what we say is heard by the person we're speaking.
Well, I'm doing my best to listen to you.
Oh, well, but this is a technique. We have to. We're looking at each other,
Yeah,
But if you're sitting not to knock your family or anything, but you're sitting at home. I mean, we don't hear everything. But
No.
in a film, it's you got to respond. You can't just have your uncle go off about his red Buick that's not working. You have to get to the plot.
What would you say are your biggest pet peeves about screenplays and movies and things that we see today? What are your pet peeves?
Well, part of it is trying to make the dialogue sound how you would speak. And again, it's not to say I want to sound like a 19th century lord speaking, but I don't know. I mean, I'm pretty wide open to everything. I watch a lot of movies. I like them. I think I'm pretty open.
All right. So I'm curious, are you an outliner?
Yes, I'm definitely an outliner.
Does it take you longer to outline than to write the script?
By the time I've outlined it, writing it is pretty easy.
Right.
The outline is and then I can discover things while I'm writing it, which are fun. But I am definitely an outliner because I've learned the hard way about how to, I mean, the thing about movies is they are essentially the most conservative art form that exists. Photography, dance, theater have all changed and changed radically over time. The movie is the 3-act structure. That's how it started, and that's how it is now. There are exceptions. There are movies like Pulp Fiction, but they are exceptions. The 3-act structure is what is how it works. It's so expected by the audience that if you don't do it, it's almost like inviting them for dinner and serving the dessert first. They get upset. It's what we said before about constraint. Mm-hmm. That's what makes the movie powerful, is that it is constrained. That's what makes the combustion engine work.
Well,
that's what makes nuclear power work.
For thousands of years, we've told each other stories, and here's what happened today during my day. Here's the story of what happened to me. And that is the way that people understand and communicate. So it's reflected in plays and movies as well.
And if you take it a step further, you realize that it's about constraining yourself by putting the greatest form of poetry, which existed for 4 centuries, is the sonnet, because it is confined to 14 lines. There's the Italian and the British sonnet, but still the sonnet. And the power is its confinement, and those are the greatest love poems written and still blurbed out at people's weddings and things like that.
And I would argue the most difficult to write.
Probably, but we artists, we think, oh, I'm an artist, I'm wild, I have all these great ideas. You're confined. I mean, Picasso was confined to this size of his canvas.
Yeah, the canvas is a certain shape and size, and put your picture in there.
Yeah. So anyway, go on about that. But no, it's interesting. I guess I learned a lot about writing after some of my movies didn't work out that well. I became like you mentioned in the beginning, a script doctor, and that was fun because you go to sets. The fun thing about that is that if you go when they're shooting the movie, there are no long days and weeks of discussions about, well, should the character do this? No, we're shooting it in 15 minutes. And if we have to go overboard, the producer, the studio will kill us. So you kind of, and they try your stuff. So that was where I really learned to write, and I really loved writing, doing that. I mean, it's a great job. You're kind of like, you go in and you do the work. And if the movie's a hit, you saved it. And if it's not, you go, oh shit, it was crappy anyway. But I did dozens of those, and I really liked doing that.
Is that pressure packed or just free to you?
Yeah, but it's fun pressure packed, because the actors come to you and you're on an equal par with the, not equal par with the director, no writer ever is, but they need you more than if they buy the script from me today and they'll make it in 7 months, because then they can, dick around with, do whatever they want with the script. If you got to shoot it in 15 minutes, you come up with ideas. They might be the wrong ideas. I mean, and they say, no, Charlie, that won't work. This should. But it's just the fun of the immediacy of it.
So you've seen this happen many times in many script doctoring sessions, and I find it really amazing that someone has purchased the script, who knows how long ago, like you said, then it's gotten bumped around by whoever, by the director, the producers, the actors may have put their input, and then they've spent who knows how many millions of dollars to get to where they are on a stage or a set somewhere, and they still need you to come in and play with it some more. That just blows my mind.
Yeah, no, it's crazy. I mean, I'm glad it happened because it was fun. But I'm in the Writers Guild, so a few years back, I used to do a lot of arbitrations, for who gets credit on a script, who's been hired.
Right.
And once or twice, I've had to read 20 or 25 scripts, and the irony is, the last script is so much like the first one all the time. I mean, I had a great writer who shall remain nameless, who came in and rewrote one of my scripts for 3 times what I was paid for writing it. And we used one line. It's good for him. I mean, it's fine.
Scripts, correct me if you think I'm wrong, scripts are a blueprint. They're not the finished product.
Absolutely.
And you still require actors to act it and cinematographers to shoot it. And you need all these different technicians and costume designers and set designers, and then somebody to cut it later, who is the final arbiter of how it comes together. And so the script itself is not that precious. I've learned that.
Absolutely. When I taught at USC, I began my first class by saying, this is a class about architecture, because that's how I look at a screenplay writer. You're giving someone, like you said, the right word, a blueprint. And the guys are going to come in and build the building. Now, it may not work. It may have to change. Now, when you go to film school, you come out thinking, I'm going to design the next Disney Center or Penn Station. What you're going to do is you're going to design a shopping mall in West Covina or one in McKeesport. It's and no offense to those places, but I'm just saying you have to learn, like I did, how to create those stories. And it is an architecture to me. I really learned that the hard way, but it's true.
Well, there are in the tens of thousands of stories that have been shot, whether on TV or in features, and there are tens of thousands of them at this point. We all know there are really a teeny tiny number that actually rise above everything else and become legendary in some way. Yeah. Everything else is sort of stuff. And some of it's good stuff and some of it's not so great stuff, but nevertheless, it's stuff.
It's work. I mean, I directed 2 of my own movies, and I will be, without being too self-deprecating, happy to say, as long as no one from the Directors Guild is in this room, I'm not a good director. And I'm happy to admit that. I don't know why they gave me 2 chances, but it's a very different dynamic from writing.
Okay, so tell us what that difference is.
All right, the first day of the first movie, we were shooting a car driving up to a building. For 5 hours, we prepared that. I walked over to the prop man and said, if you have a gun, I'd like to shoot myself right now. That's not in my personality. I mean, I love the actors. I got amazing actors, Jude Law and Frances McDormand and Maureen Stapleton. I mean, they were great, and I got along with them and everything. But I don't see or think like a director. I sit here and I write for maybe 40 minutes, and that's enough. And I go out and walk the dog around the block. I can't, actually the dog usually hides from me. It's like, oh my God, not again. But it's a director. And again, I don't mean to bring up something that will offend them, but I read an article recently that said a lot of people in Silicon Valley and scientists are somewhere kind of on the spectrum a little bit because of their obsession with things.
Sure.
And I've worked with a couple of directors that I think, are kind of so obsessed with that minutia that it's just a different dynamic. But I'm glad I did it. Neither movie really got much of a release and really didn't deserve to have a release, in terms of fighting against the bigger movies. But my girlfriend at the time put it well when I was a little depressed. She said, look, Charlie, everyone got paid and no one died. So that's my standard of directing. It's not John Ford, Steven Spielberg, Alfred Hitchcock. But you know what? She was right. Everybody got paid. No one died. I mean, it's like
it is called the entertainment industry.
Yeah, and it was fun. I mean, I get sitting at this desk right here. I came up with an idea that gave a couple of thousand people work.
Sure.
And that's the thing I'm most proud of, because I love the crew. I mean, I love the scenics. I love the hair and makeup people. Those are like, not the actors were great too, but it's like, oh my God, all these people. And there's a joy to a set, because every job might be our last.
For sure. You never know, do you?
No, but that was the joy. Anyway, directing was a great experience. And it was fun to a degree.
How difficult is it to direct your own material? Did you, the director, ever have to have a conversation with you, the screenwriter, and make changes?
No, I wasn't that good a director or that into it to say, no one would hire me to direct anybody else's material. The only reason I got to direct was because I said I want to direct my own, and the scripts were good. I mean, the scripts were good on page. Now, a lot of times, I write a script, or in this case, I directed 2 scripts, and they didn't work out. But like you said before, that's what happens. Everything doesn't work out. You learn. I've worked with a bunch of directors, and sometimes I'll work with them and I'll say, I'll ask them about other movies I've done, and in every case, no director has ever bothered to see a movie that I did before the one he or she directed.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not insulted. I just think that's really dumb. I said, somebody thought the movie was good enough that they put $10 million into it.
Exactly.
So don't you want to know what we did wrong? And the one director that I asked that to, he sort of said, that's a good point. And he still never saw any of my movies. But I think if he'd seen my movies and why they didn't work, I think his movie of mine would have been better.
Do you think that directors that you've worked with, including some of the better ones, that they have a take on things that may not be reflective of what you're trying to accomplish in the script?
It depends on each case. I mean, some directors do not like the writer around, because the actor, it's not like, I've done enough theater and movies. I'm not going to take the actor side and go, listen, this is how you should do the scene. But the actor wants to talk to the writer. They want to know where the idea came from. And some directors are terrified of that. Ridiculously so. I mean, a couple of really great directors I worked with, all I was going to do was tell the actor, certain things. And if they disagreed with, I would never tell an actor to do something other than what the director said.
Sure.
Other directors, wanted me around the whole time.
What is it that you think that screenwriters today, and it may be a tricky question because it's today I'm talking about, what do newer screenwriters need to concentrate on to make sales? Is it the ability to pitch a story? Is it the ability to tell a story? Is it a kind of story? What, in your opinion, is the difference maker from the thousands and thousands of scripts get written every year and those that actually get optioned and then eventually produced? What are those differences?
Well, I learned, from others and from myself the hard way, that there are 2 different kinds of scripts. One is your shooting script that's in your mind, or if you're lucky enough, that gets bought and made. The other, which is more important, is the selling script.
Mm-hmm.
Those are 2 very different scripts.
Shooting script and selling script are 2 different scripts.
Yes, you are writing a selling script. You have to get it past the first bunch of readers, past the first bunch of producers, until it gets to the actor, to the director. And the selling script is very spare. It has none of your wild ideas and music and descriptions of characters and all that crap. It's the basic story. And I could do a whole hour on this alone. I won't, obviously, but there are rules in writing a selling script, and they really should be adhered to. I mean, there are exceptions to everything. I don't mean to sound so pompous, but there are things that as simple as grammar, as simple as typos. If you don't give a crap about typos in a script, why should anyone else think you give a damn?
Yeah, why should a reader bother reading it if you didn't bother to get it right?
Your language is your skill. If you watch a baseball game and the guy comes up to bat holding the bat by the wrong end, a short career.
Yes.
You know,
For sure.
it's the old 5-10 rule. In the old days, they said everybody wants to read the first 5 pages, and then they jump to the last 10 pages. There's the rare script where they just keep reading, and a couple of mine were like that. So I learned that, but I was lucky early on too.
Do you think that that was because you had been a playwright prior to?
It helped because I knew when you're a playwright, although I was in some of my plays, but mostly you learn a lot by being in the audience and watching when you lose an audience.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing more painful than watching a film and you're standing in the back of the theater and you're losing your audience. There's something wrong. And the problem with a film is you can't fix it. Once it's up there, you know, it's not going to be better on Thursday night than it was on Wednesday night.
No, it is what it is.
And yeah, I mean, it's 2-dimensional and it's frozen. I mean, you know, be Woody Allen and go back and reshoot 90% of your movies, but that's not what I was allowed to do. I mean, occasionally we went back and reshot scenes, but not often.
What is your philosophy toward pitching?
It's confused now because of the whole streaming world. I really couldn't give advice to anybody. I really don't. I haven't done a movie in 5 years, and I've never had to pitch to a streaming company. I did pitch once, and we had a director, and they didn't take it on. I pitched in the older days when I came in with a little bit of weight because I'd done a bunch of movies.
Right.
Again, even if they weren't good movies, they are hugely successful movies. They were done.
You're saying something important, by the way, and I want the listeners to hear what you just said, which is that even if you've made a movie that was not terribly good or successful, the fact that you got one made makes you a different person in the eyes of people you're now approaching, correct?
Yeah, you're in a different category, you know, and your movie that you're pitching may be nowhere near as good as that guy or that lady who you know, who's waiting outside in the lobby pitching a much better movie. Mm-hmm. But it's the American business thing of finding someone who to blame. Not yourself. This is why they pick bestsellers. This is why they do sequels, because they can say, don't blame me, it was a bestseller. Don't blame me, Charlie Peters did 7 movies before this. But when Joe Schmo comes in, they'll say, why did you pick Joe Schmo? I made a mistake.
I think there's a secondary reason why they go to books and toys and games and comic books and everything else, because they already start with some kind of a built-in audience. And I think that helps in the sales.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. But again, a part of it is, and that's why the whole studio can say, don't blame me. It already had a built-in audience.
Right, exactly.
Now they have to answer to stockholders.
You know? Exactly.
So the studio head is not always the boss.
All right. So I'm curious, clearly over time, you have received various notes from various people, from producers, directors, even actors, whoever has given you notes. What is your technique for taking notes and using them or not? Do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, you never do all notes, because once it's like a Rubik's Cube. Once you change one thing, everything changes. Mm-hmm. So you can't do all notes. So find out which notes the producer or the director thinks are most important. Approach those, and generally they will forget the other notes, you know, which may be valuable notes.
It's true.
But you know, it's just a matter, it's like life. I mean, it's like your partner or whatever. You got to figure out what's worth, you know, starting a war over.
I recently finished reading Mel Brooks's excellent autobiography, All About Me. And yeah. In it, he has a fairly healthy chunk, a little bit of the book in which he talks about, he'd go into a note-taking session with the studio heads, and they would give him tons of notes, and he would just nod his head and say yes to all of them, and then not do any of them.
I know I mean, I'm not Mel Brooks, so I don't have that, but I had to do something. And I worked with some producers, you know, who did amazing number of great movies, and I had a lot to learn. Mm-hmm. So, but I think the key is, like I said, you can't do all notes.
No, and you're right. You have to be diplomatic about it, and you have to be selective about it.
Yeah, and like I said, once you change something, everything changes. So they may not even make sense.
I always think of it as you're pulling the thread on a finely knit sweater. and it just starts to fall apart. So I've been speaking for close to an hour with just fantastic stuff from Charlie Peters, who's a writer director in Hollywood at this point, but also a playwright. And I'm wondering, you've worked with literally hundreds and hundreds of people over time. Do you have a particular story you can share with us that's either weird, quirky, oddball, offbeat, or just plain funny?
I'll warn you that comic writers, as you probably know, the first 5 pages of any comedy is like a Dostoevsky tragedy. By the time we get to page 6, we can't take that seriously. Come on. And it becomes a comedy. So when you ask a comic or a comic writer to think of something funny, it's probably going to be something darker or more self-deprecating.
Go for it.
In terms of self-deprecating, one of my classmates at CMU was John Wells.
Oh, yes.
Who is one of the biggest producers now in Hollywood on television and film. And we a long time ago, before he was that big, we had lunch and he came and he said, "I'm sorry I'm late, but I have to make a decision. They want me to decide between two shows to produce. One is about a jewel thief in Paris, and the other is about a hospital, and it's called ER. Which would you do?" And I said, "Oh shit, there's so many hospital shows. Do the jewel thief one." So John was very smart, ignored my advice, and became the biggest producer in Hollywood.
Yeah, well, he made the right move there.
Yeah. So that's a warning to anybody who listens to this. Be very careful of what I've said.
Well, that's the business is so weird because you can go down one road or the other and you don't know when the other road might have worked just as well, but you don't know because he went and did ER and massive success. But
I think I'll mention that to him when I see him next time. Yeah.
Why not bring that jewel thief back up? Yeah. All right. So last question for you today, Charlie. You've already given us an amazing amount of advice in this show, but I'm just curious, do you have a solid single piece of advice that you like to give to your students or to someone who's starting out in the business, or maybe they're in a little bit and trying to get to the next level?
Well, I could give a sort of a couple of things, how to find a story, but I'll give more. And it's not really a warning. It's just having written for 60 years now, practically since I was a child. And I think this is helpful. What you write is not necessarily what is seen or read. I'll get just, if I have just a minute,
Please.
I did a story for a group, for a book of very short stories by Paul Auster called "I Thought My Father Was God." They're one-page stories that he asked for. And mine was chosen. They were meant to be real stories, and they were. And this was a real story from my childhood. And I wrote it, and it has not a shocking ending, but it has an interesting final line. It's a page, so it's not really like asking people to invest their time. No one who's read that story gets what I was trying to say. They all get something from it. Well, actually, a couple of people have, but I would say 98% of the people have a different idea what the last sentence means. But to me, it was so clear. It was so exactly clear what this young boy was going to do next. But I couldn't write what he was going to do next because it was a real story. So I just told the event. And the audience the reader mostly took an entirely different take on it. Men, women, older, younger. But it reminds me, and I'll end on this, which is about film. What I was trying to say about that short story in that book was that people are going to get things from your work that are different from what you intend. That's what the world is. They're going to think different things. But there's an old movie from the 40s, The Man Who Came to Dinner. And it's a pompous New Yorker who gets stuck in the Midwest in a big house with a family because he breaks his leg. And he has to put up with all this because he's an elitist. And one of the characters is Jimmy Durante, who plays a character called Banjo. And he does everything, and he manages to make everything turn out right. And at the end of the movie, Monty Woolley, who plays the lead character, says to him, he says, "Banjo," he says, "everything turned out right because of you. You made this all work. And as a treat, what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a book about you." And Durante looks at him and says, "Don't bother. I can't read." And that to me is the most brilliant observation about writing that anyone has ever said. Don't bother. I can't read.
Is that Georges Kaufman?
Yes, they did the play, and Epstein did the screenplay. Still echoing in my.
Don't bother. I can't read.
Don't bother. I can't read. He says it with such a great smile on his face, as only Durante could. You know, in a sort of facetious way, it does say something true about writing and art in general. People see a lot of what they want to see.
Isn't that the point, though? I mean, that's a great great philosophy and way to look at it. But isn't that the point, is that we as artists put the work out into the world, and then it's no longer ours. It becomes the audience's to do with it as they wish.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Especially in film, because you sell it and it's definitely no longer yours. But truly, in terms of an audience, so often people would see a movie of mine and say, "Oh, my favorite line was X." And I'll go, "Really? That's like I left the car door open?" I mean, you know, it's like something that is so irrelevant to the plot, but what am I going to say? You know, it's you know, we live in our own little worlds.
I think that's exactly it, that you have no control over it. Once it leaves your hands, your brain, and goes out into the world, it's not yours anymore. It's everyone else's. Yeah,
especially a film, because once it leaves, you know, you sell a film. It's like I'm selling you my car. You can paint it blue with pink polka dots. You know, a play you don't sell. You have casting rights and line change rights. You know, when you sell a screenplay, that's it.
No, I mean, you keep your copyright in the world of playwriting, but you don't keep your copyright in the world of screenwriting.
No, and that's why you have to learn. I mean, generally, I've been around the movies, you know, that they've made. So, you know, because you have to learn how to work the director. I mean, you don't walk into the first meeting and go, "I got all these things I want to direct like this." You know, you have to learn how to do it. So, you know, you do.
Well, Charlie Peters, this has been a fantastic hour on StoryBeat, and it's been so much fun to hear your take on writing, directing, the world of Hollywood. It's been fantastic. So I can't thank you enough for spending some time with us today on StoryBeat.
Oh, well, thank you for listening to me, whoever has. Yeah, no, it was really fun.
And so we've come to the end of today's StoryBeat. If you like this episode, won't you please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. StoryBeat is available on all major podcast apps and platforms, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, TuneIn, and many others. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.